Everyone hits a bump in the road. What do you do with it? Be inspired as we explore the ways people experience, navigate, and manage the ups and downs and twists and turns in this road trip called life. Welcome to another episode of Bump in the Road. The basic podcast is always free. We also have a premium subscription called Bump 2 that lets you listen in on extended behind-the-scenes conversations with our guests. Check it out at www.bumpintheroad.us. Nancy Perpall is the author of a novel, Around Which All Things Bend, that looks at family patterns and how they influence our relationships. She also has a soon-to-be-published book, The Malnourished Marriage: 5 Essential Emotional Nutrients for a Healthy Relationship. How did her interest in helping others through relationship issues evolve? Nancy shares the stories from her life, as well as from her legal practice, which focused on divorce. From that comes a well of knowledge that can help each of us create our best relationships. Please welcome Nancy Perpall to Bump in the Road. Nancy, welcome to Bump in the Road. If you would, tell us your story.
Well, thank you very much for having me. My story involves a number of bumps in the road. I got married the first time at the age of 19. My ex-husband was going to Vietnam. I was a good Catholic girl. If you wanted to have sex before you got killed in a rice paddy, I'm sorry, you have to get married. So anyway, to make a very long story short, what do you know? And I really didn't know him. I mean, we had been dating for a year, but I didn't really know him. We never slept together. We weren't together, in any intimate way until the marital night, which turned out to be a disaster. But in any event, we went on. I stuck with it for 17 years. I had 2 children, and I was a critical care nurse at the time. I worked in the emergency room or intensive care, depending upon, what department had the most need. What happened, I became a lawyer after I wrote a textbook with some people from University of Pennsylvania. And it was called Advanced Concepts in Clinical Nursing through J.B. Lippincott. And many of the nursing schools were adopting as a mandatory book. Many hospitals were incorporating as for better patient outcomes some of the procedures and the protocols that we were suggesting in the book to get a better patient outcome. But the hospital that I was working at would not consider my suggestions because I was a nurse. And in 1974, the only protocols that hospital was going to adopt were adopted by doctors, right? I mean, that was the way it was in those days. So what happened was I met someone who was a lawyer, but she had been a nurse. And I asked her, what can I do to be taken seriously? How can I make these people listen to me? And she said, become a lawyer. You'll have power. So I went to law school. I became a lawyer. I was hired to do defense malpractice, which I thought would be good because I always intended to go back into hospital administration. And my first day on the job, there were 75 divorce files. So I went to the senior partner, and now this is 1981. And I went to the senior partner and I said, I was hired to do defense malpractice. I am not interested in divorce. I'm going through divorce myself. And, I really do not want to do this kind of work. And he leaned across his huge mahogany desk, put his finger an inch from my nose and said, you have a bad attitude. Here, you do what you're told to do. And by the way, you're a woman, and this is woman's work. Divorce is woman's work. So I'm the middle of 7 kids, which is another bump in the road. But in any event, when you tell me I can't do something, well, that's when I dig in. So fast forward 6 years, I was doing defense malpractice, doing litigation, doing jury trials. In those days, we had jury trials. Today, it's a rarity. But in any event, the firm eventually lost the contract to represent the physicians. So they didn't have that work anymore, but I now had 125 files that were divorce files. So I left, I started my own firm, and then I became a very successful divorce attorney. I was recognized and I was made chair for the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania Domestic Relations Rules Committee for 6 years, which is the longest term you can have, and was responsible for, marshaling through child support, alimony, equitable distribution, custody, and all the rules associated with divorce in Pennsylvania. So, that was just a great experience, and got a lot of, had the opportunity to go into all 67 counties and talk to people. And, it was just a great experience. But now I'm retired. And although I spent 32 years taking apart marriages, my passion is to try to keep them together through speaking, writing, coaching, whatever I can do. And so that's what my passion is right now.
I want to back up a little bit on your story. You stayed in the first marriage for 17 years. And then what happened?
Oh, after I got divorced, a partner in the law firm that I was working at was very, very handsome, very, you can imagine, he's a very successful litigator, could sell sand to an Arab, could take the rattle out of a snake. The whole 9 yards. And, he approached me, we started dating. I was very reluctant to do this because, of course, we're in the same firm. And eventually, I fell in love with him. Let's face it, I just fell in love with him. He was completely different than my first husband. And to be honest with you, the intimate relationship was so much better than anything I had experienced. That was the real go-to. I was a virgin when I got married, and I told my daughter when she was 18, sleep with whoever it is you think you're going to get married to, because, that is such a part of your relationship, when you're married. If you're not fulfilled, that's a big issue. That is a real big issue. Because as Mrs. Doubtfire said, love is the tie that binds. Sex is the tie that binds in a marriage very often. And it's important to know intimately the person that you think you're going to spend the rest of your life with. So in any event, he was actually fine until he became a judge. And then he became, which happens, we've seen it in presidents, we've seen it in senators, we've seen it in anyone who gets a great deal of power. And judges have a great deal of power. Became, all of his narcissism just flourished, just beyond belief. And, frankly, I couldn't take the verbal abuse and, putting me down. In those days, judges did not make very much money. And I was making a great deal of money. And that was a real issue. Many people told me he was jealous of me. I didn't believe it. Here I am, a lowly divorce lawyer, and he's a big deal judge. And, why is he jealous of me? In the end, I was in therapy for 1.5 years after that, because I said, how do I get into these messes? So, my psychiatrist, and he actually was, he wasn't a psychologist. He actually was a psychiatrist. He taught psychiatry at a medical school in Philadelphia, but he did therapy as well. So, it was 1.5 years that I went to him. So I think I learned a lot, and lo and behold, I was never going to get married again, but here I am. I'm married for the third time, and I finally got it right. I finally got it right. And I'm sorry that I had to put my children through that. And then, my second husband had children, and, it's horrible to put kids through a divorce. It really is. When I got divorced for the first time in 1980, 2 or 3, they would say children are resilient. BS. Kids are not resilient. Kids, witness the fact that now there's a national health advisory because of the suicides among adolescents. And if you do the research and you do a deep dive into the research, a lot of the depression that is caused by today's adolescents is the fact that their parents are not present. Most American marriages both have to work, right?
Absolutely.
The kids start in daycare. And trust me, I'm not opposed to daycare. I am not opposed to women working. I worked. I was fortunate. I didn't work until the kids were like in grade school, first and third grade. But in any event, everyone is so distracted. Then put COVID over it and put the mounting financial pressures over it and put the status of our country over it and put the fact that, was it yesterday or the day before yesterday, that the Tennessee legislature kicks 2 Black boys out, but not a white woman. You think that's lost on this generation, these adolescents and young adults? There's so much uncertainty in the world. There's so much, school shootings, this, that, and the other thing. And if the parents aren't really on the needle, watching and monitoring the atmosphere for these children, what chance do they have? Where are their resources?
I think the thing you have to be so careful of, and a parent doesn't even know when this occurs, is that you can say the dumbest offhand thing, but it has such impact and meaning to a young person, and you will never know that. You probably will never know that. You might find out later in life if you get together and really develop a close relationship. But I think everybody carries scars of childhood, divorce or not.
Oh, absolutely. As I said, I've really researched, throughout when I was representing clients, I researched, and I had the opportunity. I represented most of my clients, had means. They were high asset cases. So in custody disputes, we'd hire a psychologist. I had the benefit of really having some fantastic psychologists explain what the dynamics of relationships are. And, we all come out of our childhood with a core wound. There's something that impacted us. It's just, that's the way human beings are. Nobody comes out of childhood unaffected by some negative issue that arose in their life. As you said, whether it's, a parent making an offhand comment that makes a child feel they're not attractive, or they're not good enough, or they're never going to make anything out of themselves, or they're a loser. You are so right. Those words really stick. It's like brain damage. It sticks in your psyche, and goes around and around and around like a little brain worm. And, then your self-talk starts. All the monkey chatter in your head, like, who do you think you are? You're not good enough. You're not this, you're not that. I don't know if I'm sure you know who Brene Brown is.
Mm-hmm.
Most people know who she is. She talks about the fact that when she didn't make the drill team when she was like, I don't know, maybe 10 or 12 years old, it wasn't her disappointment that impacted her. It was the way her family reacted to her. And she said, from then on, I didn't really feel like I was a part of my family. And think about that. That is so profound.
Oh, it's
because
huge.
Sometimes that happens with children. Parents get divorced, they remarry, and then the children don't feel as if they really have a family anymore. And if there's an issue, 47%, not quite 50, but 47 point something percent of first marriages in the United States go through divorce. 60% of second marriages go through divorce, and 70% of third marriages go through divorce.
Wow.
Yeah. You can Google that, your own statistics. I have those statistics in other books and research, but you can even Google it. You can ask Alexa.
How do you stop that pattern? Does it go to counseling and starting to look within and take responsibility for your own perceptions?
You stop the pattern by making sure you're making the right choice to begin with. You really have to know yourself and love yourself and accept yourself. And again, as Brene Brown says, accept the shame that you're carrying. Everybody has some shame. It's the core wound. It's the I'm not good enough, or, I feel so wonderful because you think I'm so fantastic and you want to spend the rest of your life with me, and I'm the special one. I'm the love of your life. But do you really love yourself? And by the way, do they have their own agenda? The average American is now getting married, a woman at 28 and a man at 30 to 32. Okay, in 1960, 90% of males in America were married and had been married for at least 10 years by the time they were 30.
That's a massive shift.
Yeah. You know what the percentage is now? And I don't want to misstate this. Maybe I should ask Alexa. I think it's like 35 to 40%. 90% of people were married 1960. I got married in 1968. But I'm very keenly aware of your distinction between the 60s and between the 60s and today. During the 60s, people went to church. Most people belonged to a church. When my ex-husband came from Vietnam and I moved to Lafayette, Indiana to be the nurse in the emergency room, I was asked, well, what church do you belong to? That was one of the first questions the Hoosiers would ask you when you moved into a neighborhood. Where do you go to church? Very few people go to church anymore. The institutions that once gave us that security and that sense of continuity and the moral compass of how to behave in life, it's no longer there. The other thing is that in the 60s, most women didn't work. And by the way, it wasn't until 1974 that women could get a credit card in their own name. A woman could buy a car without a male co-signature. A woman could rent an apartment without a male co-signing for her. So we had a very, very different look of a family life in the 60s. Yes, there was tremendous unrest. There was tremendous protests. But at the end of the day, you went back to a nuclear family. What happens today? How many kids go home are latchkey kids? Or from school, they go to daycare? And who's there to really say, I'm sure the daycare, some of them are fantastic, but really some of these daycares are so overworked and underpaid, and they've been there all day and themselves, they're exhausted. These little kids get off the bus, I see it locally, and they go into daycare. Who's there to say, how did it go? Did Johnny hurt your feelings today? I know you're having trouble with Virginia. Are you and Virginia still angry with each other? I mean, there's nobody there to tell them, to ask them that.
And I think even as we get older, there is no one there to really give us any rules of life. I mean, I think that as we go on, we start to realize that the answers lie within. Hopefully, at some point, you see that. And that's where you can start making change. When you went through a year and a half of therapy, were there some universal truths that came out of that would apply to all of us?
I think the universal truth is, I'm one of 7 children. When I was growing up, my father worked for Bell Labs. He was on the trajectory up, in that corporation. We had to move 8 times. Can you imagine my mother with 7 kids moving 8 times? You will understand why she enrolled me in the wrong grade twice.
Oh, really?
Yes. But in any event, that transition, that, not really having that stability you know, you build these, everybody builds an infrastructure inside of themselves to protect themselves. And I was always taking on, you know, the personality of the group that was, accepting me in the new school. Do you understand? I don't think I really developed my own personality unless I was in nursing school and then I got married. I don't think I developed my own personality and really knew who I was until I went into therapy.
I think that's natural for most young people. You want to be
Yep.
part of the tribe, and you do what it takes to be part of the group, and that becomes your identity. But I think for many people, that methodology continues throughout most of their lives. The tribe might be a professional tribe. It might be a club. It might be, I drive this, whatever your tribe is. And I think that we define ourselves by our tribes. And I think that's backwards.
I think you've really hit the nail on the head. And I think at the very base level, what I was striving for, when I was moving and moving and moving, was acceptance. Acceptance. I wanted to be accepted. And I didn't know how long I was going to be there. There was always that uncertainty. If you got another promotion, he was moved to another place. He was a project manager for Bell Labs. He did Telstar, the first communication satellite. So we lived in New Hampshire. Then he did, when they made all the cable to connect the United States and the Pacific Islands and Japan in terms of communication to the United States, he was in charge of that. So we kept moving. And I think I married my first husband because I was looking for acceptance, but I was against the war, but I was for people who were serving in the war. Do you understand what I'm saying? And I think
Absolutely.
that to this day, I can tell you, I feel like one of the walking wounded, because I think if Vietnam had not happened, there was no way I would have gotten married. I felt like it was my patriotic duty, acceptance. In addition to which, I was a senior in nursing school when I got married. My entire nursing school class was getting married. And people were either going to Vietnam, coming home from Vietnam, and some of them never came home. You'd come from the hospital, you'd work into the marital residence, and you'd see another car, either from the Army, Navy, Marines, parked in front of the nursing school, and you knew somebody else's husband died. So that was my back. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I think Vietnam was very traumatic for a lot of people in a lot of ways. And I don't know that as a society we've ever reconciled that.
I certainly don't think we ever reconciled what we did to them, the soldiers who fought there.
What we did to the soldiers, what happened to the Vietnamese, what happened within this country. It was a lose-lose situation.
Terribly ill-advised. But you know what? I think that, and we talk about the trauma to children today, I think 9/11, it wasn't just hitting the Twin Towers. I think it hit every single American who was alive then and subsequently who learned about it or was affected by it. All these kids whose mothers were pregnant, and they were born without fathers who died there. You're planting little bombs in everybody's head. There's so much insecurity about our own security. You remember when it was red, yellow, or green?
Yes. No, I think the world's a tough place, and I think that shows up, as you were saying earlier, in the divorce statistics. Assuming you can keep a marriage intact, and assuming that's best for everybody, which it isn't always. What are some of the skills people need to work through these sorts of bumps? Things like betrayal are very deep. I don't know that you can really reconcile that in a relationship.
Betrayal is probably, well, the statistics are that commitment is the number one reason people are getting divorced at the rate at which we are. And subsequent to COVID, there's a huge uptick in divorces. Before COVID, it was going down because of the age of the people getting married, the commitment on their part. But if you look at what the research says in terms of commitment, if you're really not committed to the marriage or the party to whom you're married, then you're more likely than not to have an extramarital affair, right? So,
Oh, absolutely. And I think that there are circumstances, even when people are committed, the proverbial midlife crisis is very
absolutely,
real.
absolutely. And so many times I will have heard my client who, was the was the perpetrator, if you will, who had the affair. They'd say, but it didn't mean anything to me. Yeah, but it meant a lot to her. You know what I mean? And often they would try to reconcile. And even if they did, they would be back a few years later. I very rarely saw that it would really, that trust would ever really be built again. There's always going to be some issue. We talked about a core wound when you're growing up. There's always a core wound in a marriage. There's something that goes wrong, and maybe with compassion, patience, and love, it can be healed. But sometimes, and infidelity is very, very hard to heal. And there are three kinds of infidelity. There's sexual infidelity, there's emotional infidelity, and now in family law, we talk about financial infidelity. That's a big one.
Oh, interesting. What
financial
is financial
infidelity is changing the not beneficiary, maybe a beneficiary of your insurance policy. It's taking out a loan without telling your spouse. It's squandering money without the consent or the knowledge of the spouse. It's gambling. It's paying $1,500 for lap dances in New York. It's going to Las Vegas and having, some trysts with people with whom you're not married, and charging it or taking money out of the bank to pay for it. There's a whole category of things that people can do if they're using money that really belongs in the marital estate to the exclusion of the other partner. So, I had a case that was, I argued, and this was before we actually called it that, but I argued that it was financial infidelity. And this gentleman was literally paying $1,500 for lap dances. He was working in New York City. She was living outside in Pennsylvania with the kids. He was footloose and fancy free. And he was spending like $4,000 a week on lap dances.
Well, I think there are circumstances where people get into jobs where they have a lot of power, they have a lot of money, and it totally warps their perspective on anything that would be considered real.
You're absolutely right. And that's what...
I think we see it all the time.
What is it that they're fulfilling? What need is it that they are trying to fulfill that they did not get in their, as they were growing up?
Oh, I would say it probably goes back to a narcissistic need of some sort.
Well, I'm cautious about everybody's throwing around the word narcissist. My second husband was a narcissist, so I can tell you, if somebody is selfish, they're not empathetic, they think about themselves a lot, but not to the pathological point of being almost delusional about their own importance. Narcissism is really feeling so inadequate Like you have to make all of this stuff up. Like George Santos of, he's in the Congress now. He made up his resume.
Yeah.
He made up his nationality. He made up his religion. I mean, I feel sorry for him. I mean, I do feel sorry for him. I don't think he belongs in Congress, but I mean, that shows such a deep insecurity about who he really is. I mean, you have to, I mean, you don't have to, but I do feel sorry for people like that.
So your passion today, though, is trying to keep marriages together
Yes.
if possible. What are some of the key ingredients that go into helping people communicate and form the bonds that they obviously have, the bonds that have obviously frayed?
Well, one of the, my upcoming book, The Malnourished Marriage, 5 Essential Emotional Nutrients for a Healthy Relationship, I talk about the metaphor of food, which everybody understands food. And I talk about that food as a metaphor. Water is communication. Water can either crash or can flow. Words can crash or they can flow. And I explain about how communication is so key to a relationship, and especially if it's a struggling relationship. And you've already got these patterns of communication where you want to talk to your spouse, they're not looking at you, they're looking at their phone, they're looking at the computer screen, they're looking at the TV, there's no eye contact. And how do you get them to really turn around and look at you? Well, you go in and you say, hey, I really feel our relationship is dehydrated. What do you mean by that? I mean, water's like communication. And I'm really thirsty here. I love you. I thirst to hear you talk to me, blah, blah, blah. And I give all these examples of how to approach it, because men and women use different words. And when
men and women are different species.
Completely. We're not like men. And different words are different worlds. If you use different words, you're in different worlds. And so what I've come up with is this food metaphor for a lexicon to try to get the relationship back going. You absolutely have to have protein is sex. Sex is the building block of the relationship. Protein is the building block of the body. And just going through these 5 essential emotional nutrients, it teaches people what you really need in a relationship. You need humor, which is like carbohydrate. You need healthy fats, which is like compassion and compromise. And then you need trust. And trust is like a multivitamin. And you really need that in order to shore up everything in the relationship. If you have no trust for each other, you're not going to trust, you're not going to listen in communication. It's such a profoundly important issue in a marriage. Like you said a few minutes ago, can a marriage really survive an infidelity? The trust is broken. And once you no longer trust a person, whether it's your spouse or a friend or a parent, your doctor, your lawyer, anyone, it's very, very hard to get that trust back.
I think that's very true. If you could leave people with a few key points, just so you went through them now, I think they're really in your book. Those 5 essential elements of a healthy relationship. Just summarize those for people, if you would, because I think they're really profound, and I think that they really hit home.
Well, you need communication, and communication is like water.
Right. Water.
You absolutely have to have sex. And sex doesn't need to be, penetration. Sex can be intimacy. Sex can be a private joke between the two of you that only the two of you share, and a look that only two of you know what it means. That's intimacy. And that's what you need in a relationship. It's a building block of a relationship. You need to have humor. You need to have humor. The way to tamp down an argument or bickering is through humor. And humor, the brain needs carbohydrate. It needs carbohydrate. That's why we give soldiers candy bars before they go into battle during World War II, when the dietary, when they weren't able to really supplement the diets of the soldiers as they are now. Everybody had a candy bar because they knew that carbohydrate hit to the brain was right. It's the sugar. It's the sugar. Yeah. So in any event, you need humor. And the other thing you need is compromise and compassion. And that's just like a healthy fat. Healthy fats protect the organs. You have to have them. And compromise and compassion protects the integrity of the relationship. At some point, you're going to have to compromise. And in order to compromise, you have to have compassion for the other person's viewpoint. But in order to understand their viewpoint, what do you have to have? Communication.
Communication.
So that's what I mean. I tie it all up in that. And then the last one is trust. And, I do something interesting, which I'll save if people want to buy my book. But trust, you really need trust in a relationship. Just as if you're not getting what you need from your diet, you have to take a multivitamin. And trust, does not come naturally necessarily. There's connection, disconnection, and reconnection in every single relationship. That's just how we are. We connect, we disconnect, and we reconnect in intimate relationships. So, what I would recommend is that people understand, in my opinion, if you're already married and you're struggling in your marriage, you really need to evaluate how you are going to get back to talking to the person that you want to reconnect with. John Gottman talks about bids for connection. In other words, even if it's a Cold War or a nuclear war, and you want to reconnect, you ask them something that they're going to say yes to. Do you want to do that? Do you want me to do this? Do you need me to do that? Whatever it is, you need to do a bid for reconnection. The other thing that I would say is, it's not easy. It is not easy to come back from warfare. And basically, silent warfare goes on in a lot of marriages. People don't really tell the other person what it is that's bugging them. For whatever reason, they're afraid, they don't want to rock the boat. They see that if they say something, the other person's going to say, fine, let's get divorced. And that's not the goal of the person who's trying to reconnect, doing bids of affection and reconnection. 33% of the people who go to marriage counseling get divorced anyway. And the research is why? Because they're not really committed. They're not really committed to the marriage. They're not really committed any longer to the person that they thought they were going to spend the rest of their life with. So in my novel, Around Which All Things Bend, the question is, are you sure this is the person that you should partner up with the rest of your life? And if you start to have serious doubts, even if it's 4 days before the wedding, get out, because it's a lot less painful for you and that person and any future children you may have with them. I can tell you without a question of a doubt, because I used to take the statistics down, because I always said one day I'm going to write a book about relationships to stop this cycle of people getting divorced. And probably 75% of the people said to me in the first interview, I knew I was making a mistake, but we had gotten too far into it. The invitations were out. We had a venue. She bought her dress. So they went through with it, even though they had doubts and they knew in their heart of hearts that this was not what they should be doing. Remember, we talked about acceptance? They were afraid of the rejection. They were afraid of the attitude people would have towards them if they buggered out right before the wedding.
There's a lot at stake, but I think you're right. There's more at stake if you move ahead and you're not on the right course. It's doomed to fail.
Absolutely.
You've had just a remarkable career. You really have. And you've given so much back to so many people. If you could rewrite your story, would you?
If I could rewrite my story, I would have gone to medical school. So if I could rewrite my story, even now, I would have gone to medical school and I would have done research, which is what I wanted to do. But I'm one of 7 children. I graduated in 1965, and my father said, I have boys to educate. I can't send you to college and then medical school. You can go to nursing school. So that's how I ended up in nursing school. But I've always made lemonade out of lemons in every bump in my road, which I love the name of your podcast. But, I've always had a desire, probably because of all the moves I've made as a child, to make an impression, to help people, to do something. And, I do know I've gotten some really positive feedback from my blogs that I've helped people in their relationships. I have a website, nancyperpall.com, and every month I write a blog about something. And I've gotten fabulous feedback from people and saying, thank you for that blog. And as I said, I've spent 32 years taking part marriages. And I have, I've made a great deal of money doing it. But now I want to help people try to understand that they should stay in their marriage, as you said. It's better to know the devil you know than the devil you don't know. Benjamin Franklin said, keep your eyes wide open before you get married and half shut after you get married.
Thank you for listening. I hope you'll support this podcast by becoming a Bump 2 subscriber. Buy us a cup of coffee. It's your support that makes this podcast and website possible. I hope you found something in today's podcast that inspires you along your own life's path, because sometimes a bump in the road is actually a portal into a more conscious and meaningful life.